Imagine this scenario for just a second. I want you to picture, um, well, the ultimate bureaucratic and logistical nightmare.
Oh boy. Okay.
So you have just been handed the responsibility of governing a population of 10 million people, and they are spread out across this massive, geographically complex territory.
Right.
And to manage all of this, to keep the peace, collect taxes, run the whole government, you are given a total staff of maybe 200 to 300 people.
Which is just, I mean, it's a rounding error.
Exactly. And out of that tiny group, maybe 20 or 30 of them actually have the qualifications to run any kind of judicial system. You have to build a functioning government from scratch with that.
Mhm.
And if you fail, the whole system just collapses.
It sounds like, a thought experiment that's literally designed to guarantee failure. You're looking at an administration that is stretched so thin, it's practically translucent.
Yeah, it really is. And today, we are looking at the actual survival manual they used to
Yeah.
stop this massive population from just bursting into flames. And how the men who wrote that manual ended up being tried as criminals for their efforts.
It's a wild story.
It is. So we are going on a deep dive into a really fascinating historical document. It details this late 18th century crisis in British India, specifically in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. We're going to be looking at Governor General Warren Hastings, Chief Justice Sir Elijah Impey, and this completely impossible judicial puzzle.
And to really understand the sheer scale of the panic on the ground, I mean, we have to look at the map. There's this letter from 1779 written by George Bogle.
Right, he was the commissioner of lawsuits, yeah.
Exactly. And Bogle spells out the terrifying reality of those 300 Englishmen you just mentioned. Because they weren't governing in a, traditional sense. The East India Company was at its core this massive commercial enterprise that was just wearing the clothes of a sovereign state.
So their priorities were a bit skewed.
Oh, totally. Their primary directive was extracting a revenue of £3 million and providing an investment to remit that surplus back to England.
Right, because without that massive revenue stream, as Bogle bluntly states in the source, the provinces simply would not be worth keeping for the British.
Exactly. So the overwhelming majority of your tiny workforce is just consumed entirely by revenue collection. The sheer volume of everyday disputes arising among 10 million people.
Oh.
I mean, it couldn't possibly be handled by the handful of qualified men you have left over.
It's just mathematically impossible.
Yeah. So by 1779, this created a paralyzing systemic friction between the executive branch, which is the revenue collectors, and the judicial authorities.
Okay, let's visualize what that actually looks like on the ground for the listener. We have the people collecting the money and the people trying to enforce the law, and they're just colliding. How were they actually tearing each other apart?
Okay, so picture a local revenue collector, perhaps, a corrupt one, and he's shaking down a rural farming community for more grain than they actually owe.
Classic extortion.
Right. So the local farmers appeal to a provincial magistrate for protection. The magistrate issues a warrant, and he throws the revenue collector in jail.
Which, sounds like justice being served.
It is. The law has been upheld. But now the revenue collection in that entire district just grinds to an absolute halt. And London starts panicking because the money stopped flowing.
Oh, I see.
So then the executive board retaliates against the magistrate for interfering with the company's bottom line. It was just this daily, vicious cycle of jurisdictional sabotage.
Wow. So if the executive and judicial branches are just constantly arresting each other and sabotaging each other, the entire colony risks bankruptcy.
Exactly. Someone had to force a separation between these two factions.
So how did they do it?
Well, the government attempted exactly that on April 11th, 1780. The Governor General and Council passed a series of regulations for the administration of justice. The strategy was to physically separate the powers.
Okay, so drawing a line in the sand.
Right. They established 6 new courts of civil judicature in major divisions. Places like Calcutta, Murshidabad, Burdwan, Dhaka, Purnia, and Patna. And according to the appendix in our source, they eventually expanded this to 18 courts, pushing out into districts like Midnapur and Bhagalpur.
Okay, and each of these new courts was run by a superintendent, right? Superintendent of the Diwani Adalut. I want to clarify that term for anyone listening who, isn't an 18th century legal scholar. Diwani essentially relates to civil and revenue jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, that is correct. So a Diwani Adalut is basically a civil court, and they were intended to be entirely separate from the provincial councils of revenue.
But when you examine the fine print of these 1780 regulations, the company's true priority becomes blatantly obvious.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about the money.
Hmm.
Article 13 of the regulations is ostensibly about preventing the courts from disrupting the revenue flow. But in practice, it severely kneecapped the judges.
Yeah, I know that did the source. It explicitly restricted these new judicial superintendents from directly summoning anyone involved in revenue collection from the rural provinces.
Right. So if a zemindar, which was essentially a local aristocratic landlord who acted as a tax farmer for the British, if he was accused of extortion, the superintendent couldn't just, send a warrant.
They had to ask for permission first.
Exactly. They had to ask the executive provincial council for permission to even investigate.
It's like setting up a corporate HR department to handle disputes, but explicitly telling them they aren't allowed to investigate the sales team during the end of quarter push, no matter what they do, because sales brings in the cash.
That is a perfect analogy, and the regulations go even further than that. They forbid the courts from summoning anyone connected with the revenue during the crucial harvest months.
Seriously.
Yes, the text specifically names the months of Bedhoon, Asin, Augin, and Puz. Unless it was a case demanding absolute immediate inquiry, the entire judicial system just had to pause so the harvest could be brought in.
That shows a staggering level of corporate prioritization. I mean, justice literally had to wait for the cash crop.
It did, because the financial survival of the colony depended entirely on those harvests. Though, we should note, the regulations did attempt some genuine necessary reforms for the local population, too.
Right, it wasn't all bad.
No. The document highlights Article 24, which was designed to stop a remarkably oppressive, long-standing practice. Before this, it was really common for local moneylenders to essentially exercise judicial authority over their own debtors.
Wait, like acting as a judge in a case where you are the plaintiff.
Exactly. A man was judge in his own cause. So Article 24 explicitly forbade creditors from acting as judges in their own causes. It directed all these suits to the established courts, which provided a vital means of relief to the helpless ryat, the peasant tenant farmer.
Okay, so that's actually a solid protection. So they set up these 18 distinct judicial zones, separated them from the revenue councils, and put some basic consumer protections in place. On paper, it sounds like a functioning system.
On paper, yes.
But the glaring question is, who was actually sitting in these 18 newly minted judges' chairs?
Well, that's where things get messy. Chief Justice Sir Elijah Impey wrote a profoundly scathing letter to a colleague, exposing exactly who the government had placed in charge.
He does not hold back.
He really doesn't. Impey points out that the government simply abolished the old provincial courts and replaced them with new ones headed by, quote, junior servants of the company.
So, young men who had never been trained as judges suddenly thrust into the most complex legal environment imaginable?
Precisely. Impey zeroes in on a man named John Gishard Booth, who was placed in Patna as a writer just 4 years prior. And Impey calculates that Booth, in his new role, is deciding on more property than all the courts in Westminster Hall put together.
Wow. And what did Impey say about Booth's qualifications?
Well, Impey describes this immensely powerful new judge as totally illiterate in his own and ignorant of any Eastern languages.
Oh my God.
And he goes on to call Booth one of the lowest, most extravagant, dissipated young men in the country. He even doubts if Booth was of legal age.
Deciding the fate of vast fortunes while being barely literate and deeply extravagant. It paints a terrifying picture. And Impey also breaks down the underlying math of the system, right? Focusing on the systemic vulnerability to corruption.
Yeah, he looks at another judge, Thomas Ives, in Murshidabad. Ives was being paid 1,200 Sikher rupees a month.
Which, sounds like a lot.
Right. To put that in context, while 1,200 rupees might sound like a decent living allowance, it was absolute pennies compared to the unimaginable wealth flowing through these provinces.
So he's surrounded by temptation.
Exactly. A judge in Murshidabad could easily be offered bribes in a single day that completely dwarfed his annual salary. Impey argues that 1,200 rupees is so little, it's completely ineffective as a restraint against corruption for a young man surrounded by millions.
Okay, I understand Impey's horror. I really do. But looking at it from Governor General Hastings' perspective, we established at the start of this deep dive that there were maybe 30 qualified men for a population of 10 million.
Right.
So Impey is acting shocked that they're appointing unqualified junior servants. But Weren't Hastings and the council just scraping the bottom of the barrel out of sheer necessity? Where else were they supposed to find seasoned legal scholars in 18th century Bengal?
You are hitting on the fundamental reality of the British Empire at that moment. You cannot conjure experienced judges out of thin air.
Right.
However, if circumstance forces you to hand immense judicial power to inexperienced, underpaid young men, you absolutely must have rigorous top-down oversight. You need a system to check their work. And that is the fatal flaw Impey is diagnosing.
Because the appellate court hadn't been functioning.
Exactly. The Sadr Diwani Adalat, which was the highest court of review, had been technically revived on paper by the council, but it hadn't actually sat yet.
Okay, so you have these inexperienced, potentially corrupt, quote-unquote dissipated youths wielding massive power in the provinces with absolutely no one looking over their shoulder.
That's exactly it. And Governor General Warren Hastings realizes this is a ticking time bomb. He needs to activate that high court of review, and he needs a heavyweight to run it, someone who can actually force these junior judges to follow the law.
So what's his move?
On September 29, 1780, Hastings presents a highly consequential minute to the council. He proposes giving the Sadr Diwani Adalat real authority. It shouldn't just passively hear appeals. It needs to actively receive and revise the proceedings of the lower courts, write the rules of evidence, and oversee the entire system.
Okay, sounds like a good plan.
But Hastings and his executive council don't have the legal expertise to do this. So Hastings makes a truly radical proposal.
He asks the Chief Justice of the Independent Supreme Court, Sir Elijah Impey himself, to take on a second job as the judge of the Sadr Diwani Adalat.
Yep. Hastings laid out two main arguments for this. Practically, Impey had the superior qualifications necessary to act as an instructor. These young provincial judges needed a manual, and the Chief Justice was the only man qualified to write it.
Makes sense on a practical level.
And politically, Hastings hoped that by giving Impey this new role, it would become an instrument of conciliation. The bitter contests of power between the executive board and the Supreme Court had been paralyzing the government. Hastings wanted to lessen the distance between them.
Okay, hold on. Let's look at this from a modern perspective for you listening right now. We are taking the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and giving him a second job heading a court that is essentially appointed by and can be revoked by the executive board.
Yeah.
Isn't that crossing the streams? I mean, that is a massive, glaring conflict of interest.
You're not wrong, and Hastings' political rivals immediately made the exact same argument. The blowback was explosive. Council members Wheeler and Philip Francis fiercely objected.
I mean, it's like a modern sporting event where the referee is secretly being paid a second salary by one of the teams to rewrite the rule book in the middle of the season.
Right.
Even if the referee is brilliant and the new rules make the game flow better, the structural integrity of the entire sport is compromised.
That's a great way to look at it. Wheeler argued it was contrary to the spirit of the Regulating Act. That was the legislation passed by the British Parliament a few years prior, specifically to put guardrails on the East India Company and establish an independent Supreme Court.
To check their abuses, right?
Right. Wheeler worried an English lawyer would import alien English law into the native courts. But Philip Francis made the most devastating legal argument regarding that structural integrity you just mentioned.
Which was what?
He pointed out the mechanical impossibility of Impey holding both jobs. Think about the mechanics of habeas corpus, the legal right protecting individuals from unlawful detention. Imagine Impey, acting in his new capacity as judge of the Diwani court, commits someone to confinement. That person then applies to the Supreme Court for a writ of habeas corpus.
Oh, wait. Impey, in his primary role as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, would have to decide whether to issue a release for the very person he himself just locked up.
Exactly. It's a legal logic puzzle that folds in on itself. He would literally be ruling on his own appeal.
That's absurd.
Francis argued the scheme confused the duties of a court of appeal with a superintending board. And most damningly, Francis argued that because this new position was held at the pleasure of the council, it rendered the Chief Justice an instrument of oppression in the hands of a corrupt council.
I am stuck on the ethics here. Because Hastings knows this looks terrible. Impey knows it looks terrible. Even if they don't have enough qualified people, crossing the streams like this destroys the very concept of an independent judiciary.
They were really caught between preserving the theoretical purity of an independent judiciary and the on-the-ground reality of imminent administrative collapse. And the historical debate over whether they made the right choice is vicious.
How so?
Well, historians like James Mill and Thomas Babington Macaulay found no language too strong to denounce this scheme. Mill argued the appointment was simply a bribe.
A bribe. Oh, right, because shortly after the appointment, a massive salary was attached to the office.
Exactly, a salary of 5,000 Sikha rupees per month. Mill argued this was a payoff to make Impey a tame, subservient servant of the company, effectively buying off the Supreme Court's oversight. Macaulay went even further, comparing Impey to Judge Jeffreys.
Wow, Judge Jeffreys is about as bad an insult as a judge can get in English history. I mean, he was the infamous hanging judge who ruthlessly executed political opponents for the king. So Macaulay is essentially saying Impey sold out the independence of the law for a quiet, rich life.
That's the accusation. But the source document we are analyzing today vehemently pushes back against Mill and Macaulay. It mounts a fierce, detailed defense of Hastings and Impey, characterizing Macaulay's assertions as historically worthless and just a personal attack.
Okay, as we are strictly following the sources for this deep dive, we need to lay out how the text dismantles that bribe narrative.
So the author points out the timeline. Impey accepted the immense workload of the office in October 1780, but the 5,000 rupee salary wasn't even proposed until December.
Okay, so he took the job before the money was even on the table.
Exactly. Furthermore, the text notes that while Impey did draw the salary, he explicitly offered to refund every penny of it if His Majesty's ministers back in England disapproved of the arrangement.
So he basically left the final judgment up to London.
Yeah. The author relies heavily on Sir J.F. Stephen, a later legal historian, who argued that Macaulay's account was absolutely false from end to end. The source contends that Impey didn't see this as a bribe at all. He considered the invitation deeply flattering to his professional expertise. He saw a broken system and believed he was the only one who could fix it.
Okay, if we step away from the political mudslinging for a second. Yeah. What actually happened when Impey sat down at his new desk? Did Hastings' radical scheme work? Did it stop the chaos in the provinces?
The practical mechanical results were undeniably positive. Between October 1780 and July 1781, Impey compiled a massive code of regulations for the Diwani courts. He didn't just collect a salary, he really built the infrastructure.
So how did that code actually change things on the ground? I mean, we had 20-year-olds making up the laws that went along just a year prior.
Well, Impey's code created standard operating procedures. It established rigid paper trails, clear jurisdictional boundaries, and strict rules of evidence.
It's like an instruction manual.
Exactly. A young judge in Patna could no longer just decide a property dispute based on his mood or, a quiet bribe. He had to follow Impey's step-by-step legal manual. The text states the benefit of this code can hardly be overstated. It brought systemic order to absolute chaos.
The long-term legacy of this decision is fascinating because it completely vindicates Hastings' core logic, right? Even though the immediate politics caught up with them.
Yeah, they really did. The court of directors in London panicked at the optics of the conflict of interest. They forced Hastings to reverse the policy and strip Impey of the role in 1782.
But the text points out a profound historical vindication here.
It does. 80 years later, in 1861, the British government did exactly what Hastings had tried to do. The Supreme Court and the Sadr Diwani Adalat were officially united to form the present High Court system in India.
Wow.
Sir J.F. Stephen notes Hastings laid the foundation of the policy by which all Indian legislation was eventually put under the direction of a central legal member.
It's an incredible legacy, but it comes with a deeply tragic irony for Sir Elijah Impey personally.
It really does.
I mean, he takes the job, writes the code that saves the local courts, but his enemies back in London win the political battle. In May 1782, the House of Commons voted for his recall.
Yeah, Impey held onto his office as Chief Justice until 1787, when his resignation was finally accepted. He returned to London and faced full impeachment proceedings.
And the Nanda Kumar case was the first article of charge against him.
Right. But his appointment to the Diwani Adalat, the very job where he brought order to the chaotic courts, that was listed as the 5th article of charge. His enemies weaponized this administrative merger to basically destroy his career.
It is the ultimate trap for anyone trying to build something functional out of chaos. To save the system, Impey had to break the theoretical rules of how a government is supposed to work.
Yeah.
He crossed the bureaucratic lines, he took the heat, and he wrote the manual that prevented total collapse. But because the optics of the organizational chart looked bad to politicians sitting in drawing rooms thousands of miles away in London, he gets impeached for it.
It's quite the story. We started with a handful of administrators staring down the impossible math of governing 10 million people with virtually no resources. We saw how separating the revenue collectors from the courts resulted in putting unqualified, dissipated youths in charge of vast wealth.
And then we saw how a highly controversial power merger solved the on-the-ground crisis, but provided the ammunition to destroy a man's career.
Right, and it leaves us with a very provocative thought for you to mull over today. We love the idea of strict structural rules, like the separation of
Oh,
powers.
absolutely. It's foundational.
But when you are tasked with building a massive system from absolute scratch with severely limited resources and the threat of total collapse, is the strict separation of powers a luxury you simply cannot afford?
Yeah, it forces us to ask sometimes, is the very conflict of interest that looks terrible on paper the only practical way to enforce competence?
Exactly. If the choice is between a theoretical conflict of interest and actual on-the-ground anarchy, the builder often has to choose the conflict. And history shows us the bureaucracy will usually punish them for it later.
A dilemma that resonates far beyond 18th century Bengal. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you some memorable insights into the hidden mechanics of history. And as always, keep questioning the narratives you're handed. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.